Welcome to Delighting in the Trinity with Michael Reeves, brought to you by Union. This podcast brings you teaching and preaching from our archives, and you can find more resources, audio, video and books at unionpublishing.org.
I want to zero right in on two great guys, Athanasius and Augustine. And if you're fearing more of the false theology, we are certainly not going to get it for a bit, because Athanasius rules. You're going to love him. Athanasius, his name means immortal, and quite right too. He was a real character, Athanasius. I'll tell you a little bit about the guy as we go through. He was one of those people with the most penetrating intellect. There are only a few people, I think, like that. You have guys with big minds. I think Augustine was a guy with a planetary intelligence. Athanasius, Luther, they're people with more like sword-like intelligences. Their insights just penetrate right to the heart of things. So he's a very striking read. Now, and a fun guy as well. He was born at around the years 296 to 298, somewhere around there. We don't know exactly. It's hard to get dates on a lot of people around that, especially when they're born, because when a kid's born, you don't know it's going to be great, so no one's paying attention when he's born. So he's born somewhere around there, which means that he, as a kid, goes through the Great Persecution, Diocletian's Great Persecution. Then, in the year 318, things really shifted for him. He showed promise and was a believer at a young age, clearly. Then in 318, a presbyter of the church in Alexandria, on the north coast of Egypt, where he lived, called Arius, he was very popular in his day, but the fact he had no reflection should have given it away. Arius began teaching that God the Son was not the eternal Son, that he wasn't truly God, that the Son was a created being. So he's like a super angel, but a created being. Now, he was a brilliant propagandist, absolutely brilliant. And he set up a magazine called The Watchtower. But this is still relevant. But what he did do is he put his theology into little ditties to music, and he had choirs go singing them through Alexandria, and this spread round the Mediterranean. So you'd have choirs going around the city singing, "There once was a time when the sun was not," and all that kind of stuff. And what happened, it actually turns into pitched battles in some places, because in Constantinople, for instance, other people thought, well, this seems to be working for Arius. Let's have Orthodox choirs singing Orthodox theology back. And of course, this resulted in street fights in Constantinople and all that kind of stuff. All that fun. Now, this was why Constantine called Nicaea in 325, you remember. It was basically to sort out this issue. Arius teaching. Should we go with it or not? And at Nicaea, the Arians were smashed utterly. And the bishops who met there, the vast majority, were horrified when they heard what Arius had to say. Some of them so horrified, some were holding their hands over their ears so they couldn't hear such blasphemy. There was one guy who, when one of the Arians was articulating a position, there was one bishop who actually started laying into him. He couldn't be restrained anymore, so he started just punching him, and he had to be pulled back. But after that came the Nicene Creed, which affirmed categorically that the Son is God of God, light of light, eternally begotten, not made, not a creature. So Constantine affirmed the Orthodox belief, and in Nicaea denied Arius. Athanasius was going to stake the rest of his life on refuting Arius. to uphold that the Son is eternally begotten, not made. And that's what we're going to pile into. I'll just tell you a little bit more about his life. Constantine's son, Constantius, I mentioned he actually was an Arian. Now, Athanasius was known as the great enemy of Arius. And so the new emperor was out to get Athanasius. And so Athanasius lived most of his adult life either being exiled or on the run. So, for instance, there's one time where he's getting on for 60 years old now. He's Bishop of Alexandria. He's leading a meeting in the church there in Alexandria. As he's leading it, 5,000 imperial troops surround the church. 5,000 stormtroopers. They burst through the doors, swords drawn, arrows just flying straight into the congregation. Athanasius orders everyone to leave so that they don't get hurt, so he'll just get taken himself. Just to give you an idea of how beloved he was, no one listened. But basically, they surrounded him, and his monks just picked up Athanasius, who's quite a small guy, and stuffed them under their robes and did a bunk. And he was absolutely beloved. Another time, he was on the run, and he was being chased up the Nile from Alexandria, up the Nile, by an imperial troop ship. And they were going to grab him. So it's filled with the emperor's soldiers. And, of course, an imperial troop ship can move faster than Athanasius' little dhow. And so they started catching up. And so what Athanasius did, this will just give you an idea of what he's like. What Athanasius did, he said, just turn the boat round. So they turned the boat round and pulled alongside the imperial ship. At which point the captain of the troops shouted out, "Have you seen Athanasius?" And he shouted back, "Yes, he's really close." And then he sailed back on down into Alexandria, and they went pegging off up the Nile. So he's the sort of guy he did. He had a twinkle in his eye. He was a fun guy. So you see, the picture of, him looking, you're kind of, yeah. A lot of these guys, they look stained glass, so it puts you off a bit. But he was a real guy. Now, let me tell you a little bit about what Arius taught them. So Arius taught that the Son is not really God. Now, at that point, you kind of go, okay, this is wild heresy. This is not anywhere close to where my mind is. Now, what's really interesting about Arius is he got to that position of saying the Son is not really God by going through a thought process you go through every day. He defined God without thinking of Jesus. He defined God by an alternative route. He defined God without the Son. So here's how. Don't you do that every day? You think of God in the abstract, right? And your idea of God isn't shaped by Jesus, the revelation of God. You've just got an abstract God in your mind, right? You do this the whole time. Here's where it ended up for Arius. So, Arius set out to go, who's God then? I won't think about Jesus. Who's God? Well, God is the cause of everything, but is not himself caused to exist. Does that make sense? God causes everything else to exist, but himself is not caused to exist. That sounds quite reasonable, doesn't it? God causes everything else. He's not caused. Oops, no, it's not. You've just defined the Son out of his deity. Because the Son receives his being from the Father. And this was Arius' argument. He said, we know my basic definition of God is he causes everything but is not caused. And so if the Son is caused to exist, receives his being from the Father, he can't be truly God. So in a puff of philosophy, the Son disappears from eternity. Now does that make sense, what he's saying? He's got his basic definition of God, and the Son doesn't fit it. so he snipped out a divinity. Now, that different starting point, that basic understanding of God, was going to mean that the gospel Arius preached would simply feel and taste very different to the gospel Athanasius would preach. And that's what I really want to unpack with you, to see that difference, because it's so relevant still to today. I think in many ways Athanasius is the man for today that we need. First of all, who is Arius going to pray to? Well, his definition of God is he is uncaused or unoriginate. He doesn't have an origin anywhere. And that was Arius' preferred term for God, unoriginate. So who's he going to pray to? Oh, unoriginate. What a great prayer life you're going to have. Very different to being able to pray, Our Father. Right? But for Arius, God wasn't truly a father, so you can't actually pray that. God's not truly a father. But try to think of God without the Son, and you're left with the unoriginate. And what I want to do is try to think through, so what does this God you come up with abstractly without thinking of God through the Son? What's God going to look like if you snip the Son out? What's Arius' God look like, and what's his gospel therefore going to look like? Okay, so if the Son is a created being, let's try to think, what's God like? So there must be a time when God creates the Son, according to this. So what is God like before he creates the Son? Alone. Absolutely. And that's possibly the most important thing to say. He's alone. He's lonely. Solitary for eternity. For eternity, he's had no one and nothing he could love. And so love for others is something he's happily got by without for eternity. Love is clearly not his heartbeat. So he might love himself, but he's not loving. When we say someone really loves themselves, we mean they're selfish. But so sure, he loves himself, but he's not loving. Essentially, this lonely single God is fundamentally self-centered, and he does what he does for self-gratification. It's why this God does what he does. That's the only reason why he would create. And you look at whether it's Arius God or other single-person gods, having spent eternity alone, well, it becomes hard to see why they would want anything else to exist. Because for this God, all he's had to think about for eternity is himself. And he loves thinking about himself and looking at himself in the mirror. So, wouldn't the existence of something else be a distraction from that lovely pastime of looking in the mirror? The existence of a creation is going to be an irritating distraction for him. Does that make sense? And so, if such a God did create, and you think, why would such a God create? Just doesn't seem natural. If such gods do create, they always do so out of an essential neediness. An essential neediness, a desire to use the creation for their own self-gratification, to use others. I'll give you one example from the Babylonian creation myth. The god Marduk says why he wants to create humans. Do you know why? He's going to create humans so that they can be his slaves. It's not he's giving anything. It's simply he's going to create a nice slave force so that he can use them for his own self-gratification. So this God wants to think all about himself only. So you are an irritating distraction for him. Have you ever felt that in your prayer life? I mean, seriously, do you ever have that kind of view that you think, well, God in his majesty, why would he ever listen to a mere creature, a sinner? Wouldn't it be that actually, as I, little sinful me, I'm trying to pray, actually, really, I'd be hearing from heaven, what now, earthling? But, surely I've just been irritating distraction, but such thoughts do occur to you when you have Arius God. With Arius God, you do. See, if God is not a father, not really a father, he couldn't give us the right to be his children. If he didn't enjoy eternal fellowship with his Son, well, he's never actually had any fellowship. He doesn't know what fellowship is. So he can't have fellowship to share with us. He doesn't know what fellowship is like. And so, if the Son was a creature and had not been eternally, as John puts it, in the bosom or lap of the Father, then the Son could not bring us close. Yeah? If the Son was just a creature, in his salvation, all he could do is bring us to the status he enjoyed, right? So if the Son never really knew the Father, had an infinite distance to the Father, the Son could only bring us to have an infinite distance with the Father. And so, with Arius God, the Son simply could not bring us close. There would be no real adoption in this gospel. If God's a single person, Arius God, if God has no Son, salvation is just going to look very different. So this God, Arius God, what he would do is he'd allow you to live under his rule, but you never know him as Father. He's simply your master at an infinite distance. And the way that played out is, increasingly, we have such a distant God, he's to be approached through intermediaries. Because you simply can't access such an infinitely distant God. And since, by definition, he wouldn't be in and of himself loving, you've got to wonder, would such a God ever actually have it within himself to be gracious enough to offer any forgiveness for free? He's not actually loving. Why would he bother? Most unlikely that you'd get grace from him, let alone free grace. It's certain you'd never hear what Jesus said to be true. Father, you have loved them even as you've loved me. John 17:23. You just wouldn't get that. So with Arius God, you're created to be slaves and you're saved to be slaves. This isn't a million miles away from today, is it? You hear people thinking this, well, in Islam and in Christianity, thinking this. So this is Arius God's salvation. What about Revelation? What about Revelation? In fact, let me just throw it open to you. If Jesus wasn't truly God, what sort of revelation would we have? Incomplete. You might have a book that possibly is somehow about God, but you don't have God himself coming to us. If he's not the exact representation of his Father's being, the very image of God, he's just not revealing God. You've got to ask, if God's not eternally spoken, why would he even speak? If God doesn't have an eternal word, why is he going to bother starting to speak now? It just doesn't make sense. His salvation doesn't really make sense, and Revelation doesn't make sense with Arius God. So if Arius was right, God cannot really reveal himself, and he doesn't have a very good salvation to offer. Do you see? It all rolls out by approaching God the wrong way. Okay, let's think, what would the Christian life be like? And quite apart from questions like, would this God be gracious, one thing we know is this God is eternally self-obsessed. So what would being godly look like? Being very introspective. So to be godlike would mean be like him, obsess with yourself. Which, well, we're all pretty godlike at that, aren't we? But trying to think about God without the Son, what happens is you start imagining God to be so cold and distant, you actually just then become more interested in yourself than you are in him. Because you find you're more interesting than that God. And so you become like him. Ever more self-obsessed. You become like the barren, sunless God. Well, that was Arius. Ignoring the way, the truth, and life, the one who reveals the Father to us. Defining God without the Son, the fallout was absolutely catastrophic. Without the Son, God isn't truly a father. Thus alone, he's not truly love. So he has no fellowship to share with us, no Son to bring us close, no Spirit through whom we might know him. Basically, Arius was left with a very thin gruel. It seemed reasonable to start with, but he was left with a life of self-dependent effort, because the Spirit won't help you. The Spirit's not of God. Self-dependent effort without the grace of a loving God, under the all-seeing eye of a distant and loveless master. Depressed? See where it goes with the doctrine of God. The question of salvation is, which Jesus do you know? And if you're saying Jesus is not Lord, you're worshipping a Jesus of your imagination. So, could you believe in grace alone without believing that the Son is the eternal Son? Well, yes, theoretically you could do that. I don't think it's logically consistent, because you don't have a loving God who would be gracious. So it doesn't make sense. I suppose where I would push it is to be able to say, what salvation do you get by grace alone? All that can be offered is you get by grace alone, well done, good and faithful servant. That's it. Never, you've loved them even as you've loved me. Never, this is my beloved child in whom I'm well pleased through the Son. You just don't get adoption. You can't call God Father with reality and boldness. One of the best lines, I think, in Jim Packer's Knowing God is, you can tell, something like this, he says, you can tell a man's maturity in Christianity by whether he can call God Father. For when a man calls God Father, he reveals something deep about his understanding of who God is and what he's done for us. I'm absolutely right. Can you call God Father? That's where Arius has left us. At which point, enter Athanasius. Here's his response. Are you ready? Here's his response. Now, Athanasius simply boggled at Arius' presumption. But he thought, how could Arius possibly know what God is like other than as he's revealed himself? The pride of the guy. So he says this. Now, it's a slightly complex little quotation, but very important. He says, Athanasius said, it is more pious and more accurate to signify, that is, to get to know, to understand God from the Son, and so call him Father, than to name him from his works only and call him unoriginate. What he's saying is the right way to get to know God is from the Son who reveals God to be a Father. That is the way to go. You don't go, God has caused everything else to be, so we'll call him the uncaused. Does that make sense? The right way to go is you know God from the Son, and not by any definition you've made up, or even by naming him from his works. The right way is to start with Jesus Christ, the Son of God, not some abstract definition. And in fact, what's interesting there, he says, you shouldn't even start out in your understanding of God by thinking of God as creator, naming him from his works only. Why not, I wonder? You just think through that. Why is that a wrong way to go? Fallen creation, yeah. It limits God to what is done. So, yes, God creates, but that is not his identity. His fundamental identity is not creator. Right? If you say God's fundamental identity is creator, then he needs his creation to be who he is. Oops. That's the problem with the understanding of God saying God is the uncaused cause. To say that's his fundamental identity. If he is the uncaused cause, he needs to cause something in order to be who he is. So you've got a weak God. For all his cosmic power, he's needy. He can't get along without his creation. No, our definition of God must be built on the Son who reveals him. And when we do that, we find there is something more fundamental to be said about God than the fact that he's a creator, than the fact that he's a ruler. Because there's something about God that exists before he ever rules over anything, before he created. And the first thing to say about God, when you start with the Son, is, as it says in the Creed, we believe in one God, the Father. Now you've got a different God. So Jesus says of himself, I am the way to know God, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. So being a son means he has a father. This was what Athanasius was so good at arguing. Is to say, if you have an eternal son, it means God is eternally a father, eternally fatherly. If you say the Son is not eternal, at some point the Father was not a father, and there's something more fundamental to be said. But the God revealed in Jesus is not, first and foremost, creator or ruler, but Father. And that's just going to mean everything looks different with Athanasius. With that basic understanding of God, he can pray, Our Father. But it just goes all the way down through his gospel, which means reading Athanasius is always so refreshing. He's seeing God is a father, first and foremost. Now, maybe I should just say, one of the issues that Athanasius dealt with in his time, and is still an issue today, is the fact that some people don't instinctively like the idea of a father. Yeah. Some people have just had abusive, cold, indifferent dads. And so, for some people, of course, their guts squirm when they hear God spoken of as a father, tragically. And your heart goes out to someone like that. And those of us who are fathers ourselves know we're very far from perfect. But what Athanasius wanted to make clear is God, the Father, is not called Father. That's not a projection of an idea of my fatherhood onto him. He's not called Father because he copies earthly fathers. He's not a pumped up version of my dad. It's the other way round. And therefore, to transfer the failings of earthly fathers onto him is just a misstep. If you've had an abusive father, I'm so sorry, that's terrible. But it's a misstep to think that that's what father means for God. Because he is, first and foremost, he is the primary father. And human fathers are created that they might reflect him. But in a fallen world, they don't always. And so where some fathers do a good job of looking like the Father, others look more like the devil. So what does it mean that God is a father? Well, no one I know has ever got it clearer than Athanasius that the name Father actually means something. See, not all names do mean something, do they? I often ask people what their name means, and sometimes they don't know. My dog is called Max. Do you know what my dog is like at all from that? No idea. It could be big, small, you have no idea, and I'm not going to tell you. But if I could make the jump, God the Father is called Father because he is a father. That's what I mean. It's so easy just to skip over that, I think. And what that means is that, well, a father is a person who gives life, who begets children. Now, that is dynamite in your thoughts about God, to see that. A father is one who gives life, who begets children. Because if that's the case, if before all things God is a father, then this God is inherently, eternally, an outgoing, life-giving God. Right? From eternity, He'd been life-giving. So he didn't first give life when he created. For eternity he'd been giving life to his Son. Yeah? Come with me to 1 John 4. 1 John 4, verse 7. Extraordinary words. 1 John 4, 7. Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God, and whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Get this. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. Wow. If you don't love, you just don't know God. I think it's... Do you know a mature Christian, someone so mature, so Christ-like, so God-like, that when you're with them, you just become better? Just in their presence, it wears off. Yeah? Do you know what I mean? That just exude generosity, kindness, graciousness. And you just can't be snide about people in their presence, because they just exude kindness. Yeah? I think what you see in those lovely senior saints is they're growing into the image of this God. Because what John is saying is that this is what it means for God to be Father. This God is love in such a profound and potent way, you simply cannot know him without yourself becoming more loving. So if you're not becoming more loving, you don't know the loving God. And this is what it means for God to be Father. Just read on. You see, end of verse 8, John says, God is love. But he's referring specifically to the Father. Verse 9. In this the love of God was made manifest among us, that God sent his Son. Yeah, so God refers to the Son. So God is love. He's talking about the Father there. So the God who is love is the Father who sends his Son. And to be a father, to be the Father, means to love. Means eternally to give out life and being to his Son. For all eternity then, this God, being Father, was loving, giving life to, delighting in his Son. And seeing that, Athanasius liked to compare God the Father to a fountain. A number of people have picked this up since. John Owen does it strongly as well. But Athanasius likes to do it because he's thinking, okay, well, actually it comes from Scripture. The Lord comparing himself to a spring of living water. And what Athanasius pointed out, he said, okay, a fountain, to be a fountain, must pour forth water, right? If it's not pouring forth water, it's not a fountain. Just so, for the Father, to be Father, he must be giving out life to his Son. Right? So, with this God, it's not like he has love, but love is one of his many moods. No, he is love. And so, if he did not love, he could not be Father. This God could not love. What a different definition we got to Arius now. In John 17:24, Jesus says, Father, you loved me before the foundation of the world. That's the answer to those people who say, what was God doing before the creation of the world? Father, you loved me before the foundation of the world. And that's the God revealed by Jesus Christ. Before he ever created, before he did anything else, before he ruled the world, this God was a Father loving his Son as he poured out the Spirit on him. And the Spirit awakens the Son to know the love of the Father. The Spirit makes the love of the Father known. Romans 5:5, God pours out his love into our hearts by the Holy Spirit. And when does the Father say to his Son, "This is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased"? At the baptism, as the Spirit rests on him. Or you think of the time when, there's that lovely moment in, let's take the Luke example, where Jesus, we read, Jesus, full of joy in the Holy Spirit, said, "I praise you, Father." Yeah? It's the Spirit who awakens him to know the love of his Father, and so fills him with joy, and he bursts out in praise. That's who this God is eternally. Now, what I want to do is, I'm going to do something a bit naughty now that is beyond my brief, but I just want to show you how mainline Orthodox Christianity has agreed across countries and across centuries. So I'm just going to step out of early church for a moment and just show you how some guys are saying exactly what Athanasius was saying, bless you, in other centuries. Okay, so I'm going to introduce you now to, we'll get to know him better in May. This is Frenchman John Calvin. And Calvin was superb on this, the fatherhood of God, the eternal fatherhood of God. So he's seeing that Calvin saw that since God is before all things a father, he's not primarily anything else. He's not primarily creator, not primarily ruler. If that's true, he's first and foremost Father eternally. All his ways are beautifully fatherly. Right? So it's not like he does Father as a day job and then kicks back in the evening as plain old God. Like there's something else deeper to be said about him. It's not he's got fatherly cream on top. He is Father all the way down. And that means he does everything as Father. He creates as a Father and he rules as a Father. And that changes how you understand how he acts. This is where I want to read you a little bit of Calvin. This God, being Father, is going to rule in a way no other God will rule. Now, I'm going to read you this bit, partly because Calvin's often disliked by many people. He's known as the guy who likes providence, election, that kind of stuff. And so people are expecting an awful lot of that kind of stuff and put in a very cold way. I'm going to show you a little bit of Calvin on providence. This ain't cold. It's slightly long. You can read it or not. Don't worry. Calvin says, "We ought in the very order of things in creation diligently to contemplate God's fatherly love. For as a foreseeing and diligent father of the family, he shows his wonderful goodness towards us." To conclude once for all, he's summing up now everything he wants to say about his doctrine of providence. To conclude once for all, whenever we call God the creator of heaven and earth, let us at the same time bear in mind we are his children, whom he's received into his faithful protection to nourish and educate, and so, invited by the great sweetness of his beneficence and goodness, let us study to love and serve him with all our heart. Now that is a profound observation, because it's only when you see that God rules and steers his creation as who he is, a loving Father, that you can delight in his providence. Right? Because you might acknowledge that the rule of some heavenly policeman was just. Yes, he has a right to rule. But you could never delight in his providence as you can in the providence of the Father. Yeah? We can delight in the tender care of a Father. A Father who cares about even the fall of a sparrow. And so, of course, he cares about his children. Let me take you to another reformer. And at this point, I'm going to raise a glass. It's Martin Luther's birthday today. Happy birthday. He would have been, how old would he be? 528, I think. Methuselah's thinking, young whippersnapper. Martin Luther. Now, when he was a little thinner as a starving monk, he did not understand any of all this. And what I want to show you is that what Athanasius is talking about actually fueled the very heart of what was going on in the Reformation. You might think Athanasius is dealing with who God is, the Reformation is about how you get saved. The two are intimately connected. So, as a monk, Luther had known that God is righteous and hates sin. But he couldn't see any further into who God is. He didn't understand really, why does God hate sin? Why? And it was the fatherhood of God that was very, very important for Luther as he turned. He said, when he only understood that God is righteous and hates sin, he said, I did not love, yes, I hated the righteous God who punishes sinners. And secretly, if not blasphemously, certainly murmuring greatly, I was angry with God. You see, not knowing God as a kind and loving Father, a God who brings us close, who is good, Luther found he could not love God. All he saw was righteousness being a hostile thing. Now, being human, of course, Luther and his fellow monks, they had to love someone. We always love something. Do you know who he did love? You're always going to love something. If he couldn't love God, who is he going to love? He and his fellow monks, they transferred their affections to Mary. They just could not love God. Oops. And he knew that's a problem, but he couldn't do it. Because he's seeing, here's a God who does not win my heart. He's not attractive. He's not beautiful. But Mary's kind because she intercedes for me. I love Mary. See it? And the other saints who intercede. So you see, Luther and his generation, they actually feel warm towards them because they're gracious. And God didn't seem to be. Well, that changed when he started to see that God is a father. And when he looked back later in life, he said strikingly, as a monk, he had not been worshipping the right God. Wow, that's a strong way of putting it. He'd not been worshipping the right God. For he said, it is not enough to know God as creator and judge. He said, although the whole world has most carefully sought to understand the nature, mind and activity of God, it's had no success in this whatsoever. But God has revealed and disclosed the deepest profundity of his fatherly heart. He's thinking about 1 John 4:10, right? In this, the love of the Father is made known. He sends his Son for salvation. God has revealed the deepest profundity of his fatherly heart, his sheer inexpressible love, says Luther. So Luther is saying, through sending his beloved Son to bring us back to himself, God has revealed himself to be supremely fatherly and inexpressibly gracious. There's a God he could love for the first time. And what Luther found was, not only does knowing that give great assurance and joy, knowing that God is like that actually wins our hearts to him. We go, oh, I love that God. This God is beautiful. He says, for we may look into his fatherly heart and sense how boundlessly he loves us. That would warm our hearts, setting them aglow. This is Richard Sibbes, a Puritan, writing a little bit after Luther. Now, this is almost directly a quote from Athanasius. He said, if God did not have a communicative, he wants to communicate, a spreading goodness, he wouldn't have created the world. The Father, Son, and Holy Ghost were happy in themselves. They enjoyed one another before the world was. Apart from the fact that God delights to communicate and spread his goodness, there had never been a creation or redemption. So what he's saying is that God didn't need to create to be loving. He is eternally loving. And creation is, well, the Father has so eternally enjoyed his relationship with the Son that it overflows. The Son might become the firstborn among many sons, filled with his Spirit. Read you one verse that strikes me. Turn with me to 1 Peter. When you think of, just as we get to 1 Peter, I should stop with this really. 1 Peter 5. Think of the single person God, all self-obsessed, all powerful but self-obsessed. Is there such a real being as that? Does that describe a real being? Yes, the devil. The single person God is the devil. And here's where I fear that in Christians simply talking about God, when atheists are saying, I don't want this single person God, if Christians simply reply by saying, but this God really is true, I think they're hearing, but the devil is real. There's this revolting God that you want me to believe in. Just look at 1 Peter 5 from verse 6. And look at the contrast between the living God and the devil. Humble yourself under the mighty hand of God, so that at the proper time he may exalt you. Cast all your anxieties on him, because he cares for you. This loving Father, cast all your anxieties on him, for he cares for you. Verse 8. Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. That's the difference between the single person God and the Father who eternally loves his Son by the Spirit. Cast all your anxieties on him, for he is eternally loving. He cares for you. Resist him, for he's seeking to devour you. There is God.
You've been listening to Delighting in the Trinity with Michael Reeves, brought to you by Union. Union is devoted to growing leaders and growing churches. Our School of Theology equips leaders for ministry. Union Publishing supplies them and their churches with quality theological resources and books. Union Mission supports and financially helps church planting and revitalisation. And Newton House, Oxford, invests in the next generation of theologians and scholars. Our vision is to see leaders and their churches the world over reformed and renewed in the gospel of Jesus Christ. To find out about our courses and learning communities around the world, to buy Union books, to discover support for your church plant, or to become a friend of Union and support our ministry, visit www.theola.gy.